We begin with spiraling prices of food and fuel. Russia's attack on Ukraine is worsening supply constraints that have lingered since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. Prices of wheat, corn and other grains have soared 25% since the war began on the 24th of February. Prices at the petrol pump have surged as the threat to crude oil supplies rises. The benchmark barrel WTI is at least 10% more expensive compared to just 2 months ago. But even that pales in comparison to the increase in the price of natural gas, which is up 47%. All that's fueling inflation everywhere. Prices rose by 7% in the UK, the fastest pace in 30 years. In the world's largest economy, US inflation hit its highest level in 41 years, rising by 8.5%. And many consumers may not be getting much relief anytime soon. Producer prices shot up by 11% in March, signalling more retail price hikes. US President Joe Biden says his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, is to blame for soaring inflation.
70% of the increase in prices in March came from Putin's price hike in gasoline.
Well, let's get more on this now with Joseph Foudy in New York. He's an economics professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. Good to have you back on the program, Professor. We know inflation was already rising due to pandemic-related supply constraints, and now this conflict in Ukraine is only making things worse. Do you believe we're at the peak of rising consumer prices now, or will things just get even worse?
Every month we think is the peak, and then the next month surprises us. I'm actually not just concerned about Ukraine and Russia anymore, but the lockdowns in China. So I'm actually now fearful we're not going to see inflation peak until later in the year, even with the actions of the Fed and all the other central banks.
Yeah, let's look at the situation in China because, as you alluded to, we've got cities like Shanghai, major cities, in fact, returning to lockdown measures as Beijing continues to pursue its zero COVID strategy. But we are hearing reports that authorities in China are looking at workarounds in terms of this rather strict strategy. So if and when the lockdowns ease at some point, will that be a good or bad thing for consumer prices around the world?
Well, that's going to be a great thing, but I think it's going to take some time to do a workaround. As you can see in Shanghai, sort of even the fear of lockdown makes it harder to get things as routine as truck deliveries of food into cities. And the other concern is each new variant of COVID, thankfully, doesn't seem more dangerous, but it just seems much, much more contagious. Even with pretty draconian measures, it's amazing how Omicron seems to spread. And as long as China has a zero tolerance policy, it's going to be hard to find those workarounds.
You mentioned also the fact that the US Fed is looking to raise interest rates several times over the course of the year in order to address this inflation situation. But on the flip side to that are fears that perhaps that might drive the economy back into recession. We're barely out of the original recession that we had back in 2020 when almost the whole world went into lockdown. Is that the right course of action right now, raising interest rates in order to combat inflation, even though it might even have a broader negative effect on the economy?
Yeah, I think it is, only because, with inflation getting close to 10%, that is such a larger long-term danger to us than a sort of a short-term slowdown. The last time we saw inflation like that was in the 1970s. And the lesson is when inflation gets close to or breaks 10%, it's really long and painful to bring it back down. So I think the consensus is we really have no choice. The final point to consider is the long-term driver of inflation is expectations. If people start to, in their mind, expect 8 or 10% inflation, that's going to be put into their wage demands. That's going to go into what landlords routinely write into their contracts. And once that happens, it's really difficult and painful to bring it down.
So, so in raising interest rates are perhaps one way to address rising inflation, but what other factors need to happen in order to ease the pressure on consumer prices?
So we need to sort of address these supply chain bottlenecks. The problem is those are all long-term, not short-term solutions. So we can think about how do we increase microchip demand? How are farmers around the world going to adjust if grain crops and wheat crops in Ukraine and Russia are disrupted? But none of those are things that are going to have any kind of impact in the next 6 months.
And we've also got geopolitical issues, obviously, because of this conflict in Ukraine. European powers are looking to ease their dependence on Russian energy. But some countries, especially those in Africa, simply can't afford to do that because they rely heavily on, say, fertilizer from Russia and wheat from Ukraine. Are we at the point where perhaps world leaders need to rethink their political reaction to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment?
So I think the question is like, what is the flow of goods that will happen around the conflict? I see zero chance that Europe or Russia will change their policy sort of based on concerns and commodity prices. But the question is like, will you have a continued flow to other markets? If Europe, by the way, ends up embargoing fuel, natural gas from Russia, that may push down the prices that some of those other countries face. And so it may not be as bad for emerging markets. But like I look at the Ukraine, which is a breadbasket to the world, and I'm wondering how many farmers right now are planting, the wheat crop for the summer.
And we are barely 2 years out of a global recession that was induced by a global lockdown. And are we staring down the barrel of perhaps another recession that's tied to the inflationary situation?
Yeah, and when the recession is caused by a dip in demand, we've learned governments can use stimulus, they can spend money, they can cut interest rates. When you have a recession that's caused by inflation and supply bottlenecks, we really don't have tools to stimulate in the same way. Anything we do will worsen inflation. So we're really just hoping that if we can kind of keep inflation in check over the next year, whatever kind of short-term pain will sort of revert to normalcy in 2023 or 2024. But we're increasingly concerned.
Okay, Professor Joseph Foudy from the NYU Stern School of Business. Always a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us.